He reached for his pack, thinking the forest was silent. Walter Ellis, 72 years old and hiking alone through a narrow stretch of Montana timberland, leaned down with the slow caution of someone whose knees had seen too many winters. His fingertips brushed the strap of his backpack, just enough to pull it toward him, when a sound rolled through the trees behind him. Not a branch, not wind, not anything human. A deep, vibrating exhale, heavy enough to settle in his chest. Walter froze halfway to standing, arms still extended behind him. For a moment he didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't even blink. The forest around him stayed unnaturally still. Even the usual whispers, wind brushing needles, a distant creak, felt like they had retreated, leaving only that one sound hanging in the air. He knew that sound. Anybody who'd lived long enough out here knew it. He turned his head just enough to look over his shoulder. A grizzly. Close. Too close. Its massive shape filled the narrow gap between the pines, fur rippling with every slow step, breath misting in the cool morning air. The bear's eyes weren't on his face. They were locked on his arm, still reaching back toward the pack. That single motion had been enough to flip some quiet switch inside the animal's mind. Walter's pulse hammered once, then again, louder, faster, climbing into his throat. He didn't have time to straighten his back, didn't have time to step away, didn't have time to think. The grizzly lunged. This is the story of what happened in the next 16 minutes, a stretch of time that would push a 72-year-old man far past what he thought his aging body could still endure. Tell me, what city are you listening from and what time is it there right now? I'd like to know just how far this story reaches. Walter Ellis hadn't come to the mountains to prove anything. At 72, pride was a luxury he'd stopped carrying. What he sought now was simpler. Quiet air, steady ground, trails he had known since his 30s, and a kind of loneliness that felt more like company than absence. Out here, the trees didn't judge him for slowing down. The wind didn't ask why his breathing had grown loud. The earth didn't care that he paused more often than he walked. He had spent a lifetime in places like this, logging roads, hunting grounds, narrow ridgelines where snow stayed late into spring. He knew what belonged in these woods and what didn't. He knew which smells meant danger, which sounds deserved attention, which silences weren't really silence at all. Experience didn't fade with age. It simply settled deeper. But his body, that was different. His right knee clicked on cold mornings. His hearing had softened, especially on the left side. His hands shook slightly when he tightened his bootlaces. And though he still carried a pack, it was lighter than the ones he used to haul. He had learned, painfully and slowly, that weight steals breath, and breath is worth more than gear. That morning, he started early, following a faint trail that cut along the base of a ridge. The forest was cool and quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like held breath rather than calm. Every few minutes he stopped, listening, not because he expected trouble, but because the habit was carved into him after decades outdoors. He had no way of knowing that just ahead of him, hidden behind a cluster of thick brush, something else had been listening too. Something larger, faster, older. A grizzly boar returning to a deer carcass Walter hadn't yet seen. Age had given Walter wisdom. It hadn't given him warning. Walter Ellis didn't have time to finish the breath he was taking. One moment his fingertips brushed the strap of his backpack. The next, the forest behind him exhaled, with a deep, vibrating sound that didn't belong to wind or man. He froze, half bent, arms still extended as if reaching into the wrong moment of his own life. The stillness around him thickened, tightening the air. 72 years of instinct told his bones exactly what that sound meant. He didn't turn fast. He couldn't. His neck creaked, his shoulders protested, and his right knee wobbled under his weight as he twisted just enough to see over his shoulder. The grizzly was already moving. He didn't see it rise. He didn't see it decide. He saw it in motion, muscle and momentum bound together into a blur of tan fur and dark eyes. A full-grown boar, easily 300 kilos, charging down a narrow gap between the pines with its shoulders rolling like a storm breaking loose. Walter tried to straighten, but age doesn't speed up, because fear asks it to. His legs hesitated in that tiny, fatal delay that comes with years. He managed half a step. Then the world slammed sideways. The bear's shoulder hit him first, not claws or teeth. A blunt, merciless impact that lifted him off his feet and flung him into the ground like a thrown coat. His ribs struck a rock hidden under the grass. Something popped sharply inside his chest. Not a full crack, but something that would hurt for a long, long time. His cheek scraped the dirt, scattering pine needles into the corner of his mouth. His ears rang. The sky rocked above him in a bright, spinning shape, and then the weight came. Heavy. Absolute. A front paw landed across his shoulder blades. Claws pressed through his jacket, pricking skin without breaking it. The bear didn't need to slice him. The pressure alone made breathing feel like dragging air through a collapsed cave. Walter tried to inhale and got half a gasp. Pain flared along his ribs, sharp and electric, then softened into a grinding ache. His right arm, pinned under him, began to tingle as circulation faltered. His left hand twitched against the dirt, fingers scraping for leverage that didn't exist. The bear growled. Not a roar, just a low, resonant vibration that rolled through Walter's back and ribs like a warning delivered straight into bone. A sound that said, "You're here, and you shouldn't be." He didn't move. He didn't dare. The grizzly's muzzle brushed the back of his neck, warm breath seeping into his collar. Its snout traveled down the curve of his shoulder, nudging at fabric, sniffing for threat or food or simply information. Walter stayed still, palms open, body limp, except for the trembling he couldn't control. He'd taught young hikers about bears decades ago. He'd joked that the real trick wasn't avoiding them, it was avoiding surprising them, and he had surprised this one. The bear shifted, putting more weight on him. His ribs spasmed. He tried to bite down on a groan, but a small sound escaped, too quiet to echo, too human to ignore. The grizzly lifted its head slightly, sniffing again, inspecting the straps of the pack Walter had dropped just a step behind him. Then the bear made its first decision. Its jaws closed around the padded shoulder strap of Walter's backpack. Not him. The pack. Canvas compressed. Plastic buckles groaned. Walter felt the force through the strap, pressed across his ribs, felt the tension tighten across his chest, like someone was cinching a belt directly around his lungs. The bear dragged sideways, hauling both pack and man together. Walter's left hand clawed the dirt, trying to stop himself from sliding. His fingers hooked roots, moss, anything. His right leg scraped against the ground, knee screaming in protest. He felt every inch of movement as the strap pulled tight across his chest and dug deeper into his collarbone. The pack didn't last. It was old. And age breaks things. The stitching gave with a sharp, whipping rip. The strap snapped free. The pack lurched out from under him and slid across the clearing, leaving Walter collapsed flat, breath crushed out of him again. The bear dragged the backpack a few steps away, then dropped it beside something Walter hadn't noticed before, a darker mass on the ground, half hidden behind brush. A deer carcass. The picture formed instantly. The smell he'd ignored, the sound of the bear's breath, the charge. He hadn't stumbled into the forest. He'd stumbled into a feeding ground. And the pack he loved enough to carry for 30 years now smelled like a threat to a grizzly that wanted its meal left alone. The bear pawed at the backpack, flipping it once, then returned to the carcass with the casual confidence of something that knew it ruled the clearing. Its massive head dipped, jaws working with wet efficiency. The sound of tearing flesh carried through the trees. Walter didn't look long. He didn't need to. He'd spent decades outdoors. He knew exactly what feeding sounded like. His breath came in small, ragged pulls. Every inhale stabbed. His ribs were badly bruised or worse. His right knee pulsed with heat and swelling. His left arm tingled from shoulder to fingertips. His cheek throbbed where it had met the ground. But he was alive. If the bear had wanted him dead, it would have finished the job in the first strike. Grizzlies didn't play with threats. They removed them quickly. Walter's mind sifted through that fact, through pain, through instinct. He tested his fingers. They moved. He shifted 1 foot a few inches. The bear didn't react. Its attention was buried in the carcass. Now came the most dangerous part. Not the attack, but the aftermath. Moving too soon would draw attention. Moving too fast would trigger another charge. He needed the bear to forget him, to dissolve him into the background like any other fallen branch or shadow. He waited. Not for seconds, for whole breaths. Slow, shallow breaths that hurt worse each time but kept him conscious. He counted them. 1, 2, 5, 8. The bear's shoulders rose and fell as it fed, the great muscles shifting under thick fur. Its head remained down, its ears pointed away. When Walter moved, it was no more than a whisper of motion, a slow roll onto his left side, inch by careful inch. Pain bit into his ribs and shoulder, but he kept his movements smooth, controlled. His boots slid through the needles with barely a sound. He angled toward a patch of brush 10 feet away. 10 feet wasn't far for a young man. For Walter, battered and 72, it was a journey. But it was also the only path between survival and being noticed again. He slid another inch, then 2, then 3. The bear didn't pause. Walter pressed his forearm to the dirt, pushing gently, quietly, letting his body drift toward the undergrowth. Every movement lit a fuse of pain along his ribs, but he embraced it. Pain meant he was still here. 5 feet, 4, 3. A branch snapped somewhere far off, a bird maybe, or a squirrel. The bear lifted its head. Walter froze, blood thick in his ears. The grizzly sniffed once, twice, then returned to the carcass. 2 feet, 1. Walter slid into the brush, the branches swallowing him with a hush of leaves. He dared a shallow breath, then another. He was hidden, not safe, not free, but hidden. He needed distance, he needed to get up, he needed to get away before the bear finished feeding and remembered him. But first, he needed his legs to work, and his lungs, and his 72-year-old body to give him just a little more time in a world that had almost stolen it. He wasn't out yet, but he was alive long enough to try. Chapter 2. 1,200 words. For a long moment, Walter didn't move at all. The brush pressed around him, needles brushing his cheek, branches digging into his ribs with a quiet shove every time he breathed. He listened, not to birds or wind, but to the bears feeding. Wet sounds, heavy exhalations, the steady rhythm of jaws tearing through a carcass that had absolutely nothing to do with him, until it had. He forced himself to focus. He needed to think, not fast, but clearly. At his age, clarity mattered more than speed. The pain in his ribs pulsed with each heartbeat, a deep, throbbing ache radiating from his side. His right knee felt like it had been packed with hot stones. His left shoulder buzzed with that familiar nerve-tingling numbness that came from impact and age working together. He wasn't bleeding, not badly anyway. His jacket had shielded him from the worst of the claws, and the bear had never bitten through him. Only the pack. The pack. His lifeline was lying out in the open beside a grizzly's breakfast. Walter swallowed hard. His throat felt tight, raw from breathing dirt and fear. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the forest floor cool against his cheek, grounding him. If he panicked now, if he acted like a younger man full of adrenaline and reckless courage, he'd die. Age didn't give him the luxury of rushing. It forced him to measure every decision, every breath. The bear grunted, shifting its weight. Walter's eyes shot open. He waited until the sound of feeding settled back into that slow, horrible rhythm. Only then did he move. He rolled his weight onto his elbows, then winced as his ribs stabbed him in return. His breath hitched, sharp as broken glass, but he refused to gasp. He couldn't risk sound. He used his good arm to pull himself farther into the brush, inch by inch, until the branches closed behind him. The forest changed shape around him. What had been a clearing now became a labyrinth of fallen limbs and dense undergrowth. His world narrowed to tunnels of shadow and pine. He felt like an animal crawling into a den, not for safety but for the chance to stay forgotten. He needed to put distance between himself and the bear. 20 yards would keep him alive. 50 would give him a chance. 100 might let him breathe. But every inch was a negotiation with pain. Walter steadied his breath and began to crawl, his palms pressed into cold dirt, fingers clutching roots and clumps of moss for leverage. His right knee dragged uselessly at first, refusing to bend under him. He clenched his teeth and tried again. It moved a little, enough to participate if not fully help. He crawled like that for several minutes, moving slow enough that each push felt deliberate. Twice the bear lifted its head. Twice Walter stopped breathing, his entire body going rigid. He waited for the vibration of its growl to fade before moving again. He didn't count time, but he counted distances. Every 10 feet marked another small victory. By the time he reached a fallen log wide enough to use as cover, his arms trembled from effort and cold. He pulled himself against the log and rested his forehead against the bark. The air tasted like sap and soil. His ribs felt like they were being held together by stubbornness alone. He forced himself to listen again. The feeding sounds were quieter now, not gone, just muffled by distance. "Good," he mouthed silently. "Stay busy." He pushed himself onto his knees, wincing. It took 3 attempts. When he finally managed it, he looked like a man kneeling at a gravesite, back hunched, head low, hands trembling. Standing would be harder, but he needed to see. He needed to orient himself. The ridge was somewhere east. His truck was somewhere south. The small ranger station where he'd checked in lay past 2 miles of uneven terrain. He didn't have his map. He didn't have his water. He didn't even have his walking stick. But he had one advantage. He'd hiked this wilderness since the 1970s. The shape of it lived inside him. He rose slowly, using a low-hanging branch for balance. The muscles along his side screamed. The world tilted once, twice, before settling. He blinked until his vision steadied into something usable. The clearing lay behind him, invisible through the heavy brush. He couldn't see the bear anymore. That was both blessing and curse. Not hearing it meant it wasn't right on top of him, but it also meant he had no idea which direction it might go next. He needed to move, quietly, consistently, and he needed to accept that he might not be out of danger yet. Bears often circled feeding sites. Sometimes they followed the scent of anything that had been there, including him. He limped forward, gently pushing branches aside, choosing terrain that minimized noise, even if it meant more pain. His breathing remained shallow. Every deep inhale punished him, but he didn't stop. Fear wasn't behind him anymore. It was all around him, woven into the forest like a second canopy. Eventually the brush thinned, giving way to a slope littered with pine cones and rocks. Walter gripped a tree trunk for support, then took his first proper step since the attack. Pain flared down his right leg, bright and sudden. His knee buckled, and he caught himself against the tree with a rough grunt he couldn't stop. He froze instantly, heart hammering. The forest stayed quiet. No footsteps behind him, no breath, no growl. He exhaled slowly and pushed forward again. One step, then another, then another. He carved a path that wasn't the easiest but the safest. A game trail dipped beside a narrow creek bed. He followed it. The presence of water comforted him. Its sound masked his movements. The moist soil gave under his boots, muffling each step. If he needed to hide, the creek bed offered rocks and overhangs. If he needed to mask scent, water helped with that too. Every 50 yards he stopped, pressing a hand to his ribs while watching the forest behind him, searching for any shift of fur or shadow. He saw nothing. But he didn't trust quiet forests anymore. Quiet meant unknown. Eventually he reached a downed tree spanning the creek. The old trunk was wide enough to sit on. He lowered himself carefully, easing pressure off his knee. His breath came in thin, uneven drafts. He looked down at himself for the first time since the attack. Dirt streaked his arms. Pine needles were stuck to his shirt. A bruise already bloomed under his ribs, darkening by the minute. His right sleeve was torn where the bear had pinned him, and his elbow throbbed from the fall. He looked like a man who had been run over by the mountain itself. But he was upright, conscious, moving. He pressed a trembling hand to his ribs and whispered, "I'm not done yet." He needed a direction. He needed a plan. And he needed to decide whether to head straight south toward the ranger station or angle east to higher ground where he could spot the valley. The choice mattered. One offered help. The other offered visibility. He closed his eyes, tracking the landscape in memory, shaping it like clay inside his mind. He pictured ridges, valleys, the trail he'd come in on. Then he heard something. A stick snapped, not close but not distant either. Far enough that it wasn't right behind him. Close enough that it wasn't meaningless. Walter's eyes snapped open. His breath froze mid-chest. Had the bear circled? Had something else entered the area? Another hiker, another animal? He couldn't assume safety. Age didn't give him faster legs, but it gave him logic. And logic said, move while you can, because standing still in the wild is a promise to nothing but the wild itself. Walter pushed himself upright again. His legs trembled, but they worked. His ribs protested, but they held. He stepped off the log and continued downstream, deeper into the trees, choosing shadows over open spaces. Every branch he passed felt like a decision. Every sound behind him felt like a warning. Every heartbeat felt borrowed. And he kept going anyway, because survival wasn't about being strong. It was about refusing to stop. If you were in his place, injured, alone, 72 years old, what memory from your life do you think would push you to keep moving? Tell me in the comments. You never know which story might help someone else hold on. Walter followed the creek because it gave him something the forest no longer did: direction. Water always led somewhere, downhill, toward the valley, toward the ranger station if he judged correctly. He didn't trust his ability to hike ridgelines anymore, not with a knee that threatened collapse every fifth step, not with ribs that ached every time he breathed too deep. But a creek. A creek was a trail carved by time itself. Even an old man could follow that. The water ran shallow beside him, weaving around stones, murmuring over gravel like a whisper meant only for those who paid attention. He tried to match its pace, not fast, not slow, just steady. Every time his knee buckled, he stopped. Every time his ribs stabbed him, he paused. Survival now wasn't about endurance, it was about persistence. A gust of wind funneled through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and cold earth. Walter inhaled sharply, testing the air for anything else, any trace of the heavy musk he prayed he would never smell again. He didn't catch it. That worried him more than if he had. Bears didn't always announce themselves. He kept moving. The terrain shifted into a narrow corridor between two slopes, the creek slipping through the middle like a vein of silver. Walter stayed close to the bank, using exposed roots for balance. His boots slid on mud slick from the morning melt, and twice he had to grab saplings to keep himself upright. The bark scraped his palms, but he preferred that to the ground scraping his ribs again. Minutes, maybe an hour, passed before he heard something new. A distant thump, then another, then a low, rhythmic vibration he felt more in his bones than in his ears. Footsteps, heavy ones. Walter froze mid-step, holding his breath so tightly his ribs spasmed. He tilted his head, listening. The forest breathed around him, leaves shifting in a faint breeze, a jay calling somewhere upslope, the creek hissing below. Then, there it was again. A heavy, deliberate step. Not a deer. Not an elk. Something weightier. His blood chilled. He crouched behind a cluster of young pines, lowering himself into the shadows. The pain was sharp, but he embraced it, better pain than discovery. He steadied himself against a trunk and tried to peer through the needles without moving them. At first, he saw nothing. The forest was a maze of greens and browns, shifting with every breeze, blurring depth and distance. Then, between two firs on the opposite slope, something moved. A shape, low, broad, slow. Walter's jaw tightened. The grizzly. It wasn't following the creek, not directly, but it was moving parallel to it, crossing the slope with the casual authority of something that owned every inch of ground it stepped on. Its head dipped as it walked, nose sweeping side to side, following a scent Walter couldn't smell but knew too well. His scent. He closed his eyes for one trembling breath, forcing the panic down. Panic was noise. Panic was movement. Panic was death. He opened them again, tracking the animal's path. The bear reached a fallen log, paused, lifted its head, sniffed. Walter flattened himself even more against the ground, feeling bark scrape his cheek. The bear grunted and continued downhill, moving past the log and stepping over a patch of brambles. It was searching, but not carefully, not urgently. That saved him, for now. Walter waited until the massive shape disappeared behind a bulge of terrain, swallowed by the trees. He counted to 60, slowly, steadily, before rising to his feet. The pain in his ribs forced a groan from him, one he couldn't entirely silence. He clenched his jaw and pressed his hand to his side. "Keep going," he whispered. He couldn't stay near the creek anymore. The bear might circle. Bears did that. Looped around areas, checked wind patterns, doubled back. He needed a new path, one that didn't leave him exposed on open banks. Ahead, a narrow deer trail cut diagonally up the slope. It wasn't steep, but it wasn't easy either. He had used it decades ago when he was younger, stronger, less breakable, but it led toward a ridge where he could orient himself. It was high ground, and high ground meant visibility. He limped toward it. The trail began as a faint line of flattened brush, barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. Branches snagged his jacket, tugging him sideways, forcing him to move with his arms tucked close. His ribs screamed in protest. His knee shook violently on every upward push, but he refused to let it fold. Halfway up, he stopped, not because of pain, though pain was everywhere, but because something else had reached him. Silence. Deep, unnatural silence. Not the silence of a forest resting, the silence of a forest watching. Walter pressed a hand to a tree trunk and listened. Nothing. No birds, no wind, no insects, no creek. As if the whole mountain had inhaled and hadn't decided whether to exhale again. He looked downslope. A shadow moved. Not the bear, not yet. He hoped, but something large enough to tilt the world inside him. He kept still, heart pounding, lungs half empty because they hurt too much to fill. The shadow paused, then shifted behind a thicket. He didn't wait to see more. He forced himself up the last stretch of the trail until he reached the ridge. The climb had cost him more breath than he could afford. He bent forward, hand braced on his knee, chest rising and falling like a man breathing broken glass. When he lifted his head, he saw the valley, a spread of green scattered pines, patches of shadow where the morning hadn't reached. And there, far beyond the first line of trees, the faint glint of a ranger station roof. Not close, but real, reachable. He exhaled shakily. Below, branches snapped. Walter turned sharply, gripping a nearby rock for balance. The forest shifted beneath him, a mosaic of movement and stillness. He couldn't see the bear. That terrified him more than seeing it would have. He needed to move again. Down the ridge, across the open slope, then through a cluster of old aspens that might hide him long enough to put real distance between himself and the animal. He took the first step. His knee held. The ground held. The world kept spinning, but slowly enough that he could stay upright. Step by step he descended the ridge, moving with the cautious precision of someone whose body had limits and whose mind understood every one of them. His boots slid on loose dirt. He caught himself on a root. He limped through a patch of ferns. At the base, he crouched behind a fallen trunk, scanning the trees behind him. No bear, not yet. He pushed forward again, deeper into the aspens, deeper into safety that wasn't guaranteed, but was possible. As long as he kept moving, as long as he refused to stop, as long as 72 years of life still meant something in the wild. Walter moved through the aspens with the slow, stubborn determination of a man who knew that stopping was more dangerous than pain. The trees stood close together, their pale trunks like thin pillars rising toward a sky he could barely see. Their leaves fluttered softly, whispering against one another, casting shifting patterns of gold and shade across the ground. This part of the forest felt gentler, narrower paths, softer earth, fewer dead branches waiting to snap underfoot. Walter welcomed it. Every reduced sound was one less chance for the bear to pick up his trail. His breath came shallow, labored, each step pressed against his ribs like a hand tightening inside his chest. He kept one arm wrapped around his torso, trying to brace himself as he walked. His right knee complained with every incline, but the terrain here was forgiving, sloping gradually downward instead of up. He could manage this. Ahead, the trees parted slightly, revealing a small meadow dotted with tall grass and the remains of an old fire ring. stones blackened at their centers, empty now but clearly used within the last few weeks. Walter squinted at it. Campers, maybe hunters. Someone had made a temporary home here. And if he was lucky, they hadn't packed out every trace of their visit. He crossed the meadow cautiously, scanning for movement. Nothing but the faint sway of grass in a gentle breeze. He approached the fire ring and crouched beside it, easing down onto one knee with a groan he tried to swallow. His ribs protested immediately, sharp pain shooting across his side. He breathed through it and examined the stones. No warmth, no footprints he could easily follow. But ash remained, dry and soft. A campsite abandoned, not forgotten. He looked around again, eyes adjusting to the subtle shapes beneath the aspens. Something caught his attention, a scrap of blue hanging from a low branch. Fabric. He limped toward it and pulled it free. A torn glove, thin, synthetic, the kind hikers wore, a good sign. Whoever left it had walked toward the valley, toward the general direction of the ranger station. He slipped the glove into his pocket, not because he needed it, but because it felt like contact with another human life, a reminder he wasn't entirely alone in these mountains. He straightened slowly, biting back a grunt, and continued toward the far edge of the meadow. Every few steps, he stopped to listen. Every few breaths, he turned to check the trees behind him. The bear hadn't appeared, but fear had its own gravity. It tugged at his attention constantly, pulling his gaze backward even when logic told him to focus forward. When he reached the opposite tree line, he paused again. This section of forest was darker, denser pines mixed with aspen skeletons, the canopy thicker overhead. The temperature dipped. The air smelled of damp earth and sap. He stepped inside. The ground changed almost immediately. Moss covered large patches, softening his steps. Fallen needles dampened sound. He moved more quietly here, but also more cautiously. Quiet forests could hide anything. The world narrowed into shadows. Sunlight filtered weakly between branches, painting the path in dim, uneven patches. Walter used his left hand to steady himself as he walked, sliding it along rough trunks whenever his knee wobbled. Pain pulsed with each movement, but the rhythm of it became familiar. Breath, step, ache, repeat. Survival was a pattern he could follow as long as he didn't break the sequence. After several minutes, the trees thinned again, revealing a slope scattered with old boulders. A faint game trail wove between them, a path used by deer and elk, maybe even other hikers. Walter followed it, choosing each step with care. Loose stones shifted under his boots, forcing him to slow down even more. Halfway across the slope, he heard something that froze him mid-step, a low, distant rumble. Not thunder, not wind, a growl, not near, but not far enough. He turned slowly, scanning the trees below. Shadows shifted, branches swayed. For a long moment, he saw nothing. Then, just as he let himself breathe again, a shape appeared between two dark trunks, large, broad, moving uphill. The Grizzly. Walter felt the cold realization settle deep in his gut. It had circled. It was sweeping the terrain, working the wind, searching for the intrusion it had punished once already. He crouched behind a boulder, gripping it with both hands to keep his balance. His ribs screamed. His knee buckled. He forced himself lower until he was almost sitting, back pressed to the cold stone. He watched. The bear moved deliberately, head low, sniffing the air. It wasn't following its nose in a straight line. It was zigzagging, a slow, methodical search. Walter's scent would be weaker now, diluted by the creek, broken by brush, scattered by wind. But weaker didn't mean gone. He needed to stay invisible, completely still. A shadow among shadows. The bear paused, lifting its massive head, eyes scanning the slope. Walter held his breath until his lungs ached. His ribs tightened painfully. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Seconds stretched. Then the bear turned, not toward Walter, but toward a cluster of fallen logs farther downslope. It huffed softly and angled toward them, distracted by something he couldn't see. Walter didn't question the gift. He used the moment to slide deeper behind the boulder, pressing himself into the narrow gap between stone and earth. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't safe. But it was hidden. The bear moved on, slowly, deliberately, away from him. Only when the animal disappeared behind a curve in the terrain did Walter allow himself to breathe again. The exhale came out shaky, almost fragile. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't risk being found again. He pushed himself to his feet, gripping the rough surface of the boulder for leverage. His ribs felt like cracked boards inside his chest. His right knee trembled violently. He steadied himself until the world stopped tilting. Then he continued upward. The trail curved around the slope and began descending into a narrow corridor of pines. The air grew cooler still, the shadows longer. Walter walked carefully, using the trees to support his weight. Every step felt borrowed, every breath an argument with pain. But he didn't stop. He followed the slope until the trees opened into a rocky outcrop overlooking a small valley. And there, far in the distance, he saw what he had hoped to find: a dirt road, thin, winding, hard to spot from a distance, but real. The ranger station couldn't be more than a mile beyond it. Walter closed his eyes. Relief didn't feel like a burst. It felt like a slow, thawing warmth spreading through his chest, easing the fear for a moment. He began the descent toward the valley, slowly, carefully. Every movement a negotiation with the body he'd inhabited for more than 7 decades. The forest watched him, silent and watchful. But the only footsteps he heard now were his own, uneven, halting, but moving forward. As long as he moved, he was still in the fight. The hillside was steeper than Walter expected. From above, it had looked manageable, an angled descent with scattered rocks and small trees to use as handholds. But the moment he began down, his knee reminded him that steepness is relative. What a 40-year-old sees as a slope, a 72-year-old feels as a test. He angled sideways, planting each step carefully, leaning into the hill to distribute weight. Gravel shifted beneath his boots, sliding in tiny avalanches. He grabbed a sapling for balance. The thin trunk bent dangerously, but held. His ribs flared with pain as he steadied himself, and he paused until the stabbing ache eased back into its familiar throb. The dirt road at the valley floor looked close, too close almost, an illusion offered by open space. A mile could look like 20 yards when desperation narrowed the world. He kept moving anyway. Each step was a bargain between gravity and will. Halfway down, the terrain changed abruptly. The hillside dipped into a loose scree field, jagged stones piled over decades, shifting like marbles underfoot. Walter stood at the edge of it, breathing heavily, studying the unstable surface. Crossing it would be loud. Crossing it would be risky. But turning back was worse. He stepped onto the first patch. The stones slid instantly. His right foot skidded 6 inches downslope before catching. His ribs screamed. He clenched his teeth and tested another step. It held. Then another. Then another. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he crossed the scree, placing each foot as delicately as someone diffusing a mine. Sweat dripped into his eyes. His breath rasped. The air tasted metallic, like fear grinding through the back of his throat. When he reached the far side, he braced himself against a larger rock and closed his eyes for one long, shaking exhale. He didn't stay long. Stillness meant thinking too much about the bear, about the distance, about the pain threading his body. Thinking slowed the legs. He needed movement more than comfort. He descended into a stretch of tightly clustered pines. The ground softened again, padded by deep layers of needles. Walter forced himself to pick up the pace, not a walk, not a shuffle, but something in between. Enough forward momentum to make progress without jarring his ribs too hard. Branches brushed his shoulders. Shadows rippled across his path. He kept checking behind him every few steps, half expecting to see the grizzly's silhouette drifting between trees like a living boulder. He saw nothing, but the silence pressed around him. Silence had weight in these woods. Then unexpectedly a sound, water. A deeper stream flowing ahead, its voice louder and steadier than the creek he'd left behind. Walter angled toward it. Water meant direction, meant masking noise, meant a break in terrain that could give him access to the valley floor. The trees thinned and he stepped onto a gravel bar beside the stream. The water ran fast, a guide pulling him forward. He followed its curve until he saw it, a gap in the trees where sunlight broke through, bright and open. He limped toward it. The opening revealed a wide meadow, golden grass swaying in a gentle breeze. And beyond that, cutting across the landscape like a dark ribbon, the dirt road. Walter stopped at the edge of the meadow. Relief almost buckled his legs. He swallowed against the tightness in his throat. The road wasn't safety, but it was a beginning of safety. Humans followed roads. Ranger trucks followed roads. Radios worked near roads. Injured men could be found near roads. He stepped into the meadow. The grass brushed his knees. The sun warmed his face. For the first time since the attack, he felt something other than cold and urgency. He felt the world widen just enough for hope to fit inside. Then the breeze shifted. The smell hit him first. Not blood, not rot, not anything metallic. Fur, heavy, musky, undeniable. Walter froze. He turned his head slowly, too slowly, and scanned the tree line behind him. The shadows wavered. The pines leaned slightly in the wind. And then he saw it. A shape. Broad. Massive. Moving out of the trees, the grizzly stepped into the meadow, not charging, not roaring, not rushing, walking, head low, shoulders rolling. Eyes fixed on the lone figure standing in open grass. Walter's pulse thudded once, then twice, then began to climb. He backed up one step, then another, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He knew the rule: don't run, don't trigger the chase, but every instinct in his body screamed to flee. The bear continued forward. It was too far to close the distance immediately, maybe 100 yards, but not far in bear terms. Walter's breath hitched. His ribs stabbed. His knee trembled violently. He felt every one of his 72 years gather inside him like stones. He kept moving backward until his boot found firmer ground. The shoulder of the dirt road wasn't far. He could reach it. He could... The bear grunted, a low, pulsed sound that vibrated across the meadow. Walter stopped. The animal wasn't bluffing. It had found his trail again. Not by sight, by scent, by pattern, by some ancient instinct that tethered the two of them together across this valley. Walter raised his hands slowly, not high, just enough to show he wasn't a threat. The bear didn't care. It took another step, and another. Walter's breath shook. He forced his voice steady. "Easy," he whispered. "I'm leaving, I'm gone." His words dissolved into the wind. The road lay 10 yards behind him. 10 yards of uneven ground, 10 yards of broken grass, 10 yards of hope. He didn't turn his back. He walked backward, one step at a time, every muscle rigid with fear and determination. The bear matched him, not exactly step for step, but with a terrible, steady interest. 5 yards, 3, 2. Walter's heel touched the compact dirt of the road. He exhaled. He didn't run. He didn't dare. But he turned slightly, angling his body so he could move faster, without giving the bear a full flank to chase. He started walking down the road, leaning into each step. Every 20 feet, he glanced over his shoulder. The bear had stopped at the edge of the meadow. It watched him. Watched until he reached the curve in the road. Watched until the trees claimed him again. Watched until the mountains swallowed him whole. Only then did it turn away. Walter kept walking long after it disappeared. The road stretched ahead of him like a final promise, winding toward the ranger station somewhere beyond the next rise. His ribs hurt. His knee sang with pain. His breath came uneven and shallow, but he moved. One step, then another, then another. Because survival was never about outrunning the wild. It was about outlasting the moment you thought it would take you. And Walter Ellis, 72 years old, battered, bruised, and barely upright, was still here, still moving, still alive. He wasn't at safety yet, but he was close enough to taste it. Walter didn't remember the last half-mile clearly. His body carried him more than his mind did, each step a stubborn argument against collapse. The road curved toward a cluster of pines, then opened onto a small clearing where a metal sign stood tilted in the dirt. Ranger Station, Namo 3 MI. He stopped, leaning heavily on the post. breath trembling in and out of him. His vision blurred for a moment, darkening at the edges, then steadied again. He wasn't safe yet, but he had crossed some invisible threshold between fear and survival. When he reached the cabin, he saw the truck parked outside, heard the faint hum of a generator. A ranger stepped out onto the porch, coffee mug in hand, ready to greet an ordinary visitor on an ordinary morning. But Walter looked nothing like ordinary. The ranger froze. The mug dropped, and before Walter could lift a hand to wave, his legs folded beneath him. Arms caught him before he hit the ground. Voices rose, urgent, controlled, familiar in their concern. And finally, after what felt like hours of silence, Walter allowed himself to let go. He had made it. 72 years behind him. 16 minutes that almost ended everything. But he had made it. Before you go, tell me something. What moment from your life taught you that you were stronger than you thought? I'd truly like to hear your story.